Our guest speaker today is going to be introduced by Erica Fox Brindley, who is in Asian Studies and History.
Hi, I'm happy to introduce our guest speaker for today, Professor Curie Virag. She is currently visiting faculty in the Departments of Philosophy and Medieval Studies at the Central European University in Budapest. She works in the fields of pre-modern Chinese philosophy and intellectual history, spanning as early, her first book is on early China, even though she's trained in medieval, and she spans the entire 1,500 years of this really early period, early imperial, and then medieval period as well in East Asia. And she's working primarily on the philosophy of emotions, cognition, and subjectivity. Her book, The Emotions in Early Chinese Philosophy, was published in 2017 with Oxford University Press. Recently, Professor Virag has won funding from the Jiang Jingguo Foundation to run a multi-year lecture series called The Human and the Sciences of Nature, Chinese and Comparative Perspectives. She's also a senior research fellow and co-project director of a cross-cultural China-Byzantium research project, funded by a grant from the European Research Council Consolidator and located at the University of Edinburgh. The project is called Classicizing Learning in Medieval Imperial Systems, Cross-Cultural Approaches to Byzantine Paideia and Tangsong Xue. So the title of her talk today is The Garden as a Site of Pleasure in China and Byzantium, What We Can Learn from Comparing Medieval Traditions. Please welcome Professor Virag.
Thank you, Erica. Okay, it's working. Is it too loud?
No, it's perfect.
Okay, thank you so much for the kind introduction. Thank you for the invitation to the Department of Comparative Literature for hosting me and for bringing me here. It's my first visit to Penn State, and it's beautiful. I don't want to go home anymore. And I can't think of a better time and place to be giving a talk about the pleasure of gardens. So this is a very nice time to be here. And also I just have to say that I'm glad that I turned up on the day of your award ceremony, because it did give me a chance to get a glimpse of this warm, energetic community and just the kind of connections that you all have here. So that's what makes a great department. And thanks for showing that to me. So I mentioned a bit about the larger project that my paper is falling under. So I just wanted to say a few words about that. First of all, this paper is a joint project with my colleague Fortune Stingel, who is a postdoctoral research fellow of the Pi3 project that I'm co-directing in Edinburgh. The larger project itself is a 5-year kind of major exploration, cross-cultural exploration of middle period China and Byzantium. And it focuses on the culture of learning. And it's looking at basically the development of the culture of learning, ethical norms, as well as learning practices in China and Byzantium, roughly from about 700 to 1200. And we're focusing particularly on the aspect of classicizing learning, right? So on forms of learning that appeal to and that seek to revive a certain kind of authoritative antiquity. And we're interested in examining both parallels and divergences in the trajectories of these two very different cultures, but also we're interested, none of us are comparativists. We don't identify as comparativists. And what we want to do, at least half of what we're interested in, is just to sit down with people working on other traditions and finding our own blind spots, finding what kinds of narratives have been told about our own fields. And what's really striking is that the same kinds of generalizations about Chinese history, Chinese development, have been made about Byzantium, right? These have been the most I guess, those widely cited other of the Western tradition. So it's really fascinating to see these trajectories. And that helps us, I think, come up with new narratives and to shed light on topics that we haven't even imagined before. So that's part of our interest in the project. Now, what makes China and Byzantium worth studying together is the fact that both are imperial bureaucratic systems, and they're very much steeped in classicizing learning. They have a contingent of literati who shared a certain culture of learning and learning practices. And of course, as I mentioned, they are both these sort of the kind of paradigmatic non-Western civilizations. Now, the crucial part of our project is a collaboration between people who are sinologists and Byzantinists. And I just wanted to give you, this is just a snapshot of the main page of our website. Anyone who's interested in this period, interested in comparative, a deeply historical, comparative, cross-cultural exploration of learned culture, get in touch. We have conferences, we have research seminars. We'd love to connect with you and to expand the repertoire. Actually, our second conference is not just about China and Byzantium, it's trans-Eurasia and beyond. So, because I think we want to understand sort of what the larger structures are in this period. And so we see the China-Byzantium thing as a kind of starting point. And if anyone happens to find themselves in Edinburgh this May and wants to come and observe our conference, you're more than welcome. Please get in touch. Okay, so the paper that I'm presenting, so what I'm presenting is actually a sketch of a larger paper that we're working on with Botanistine Group. And the topic is the topic of this paper, and it's very much a work in progress. So I would really welcome criticism, suggestions, any ideas that you might have for improving the paper. So in the 11th century, in both China and Byzantium, the garden emerged as a major site of aesthetic appreciation among educated elites. In Song China, literati devoted tremendous energy to gardens, constructing them, to caring for them, to collecting beautiful objects to put into the gardens, naming them, and of course writing about them. In Byzantium, literati are rarely attested to have been involved in the construction of gardens. As far as we know, no 11th century literatus owned a garden, so there's a very big difference with Chinese literati. But gardens featured prominently in their writings. Now, a major theme in these writings was the pleasure to be enjoyed in these gardens. So Byzantine writings engaged with gardens as beautiful spaces containing beautiful objects, and the pleasure afforded by them is considered an essential feature of experiencing and describing them. Similarly, in 11th century China, writings about gardens and about related things like landscapes, pavilions, and other sort of cultural goods valued by literati particularly emphasize their pleasure-conferring properties. Indeed, two well-known gardens, those of Sima Guang and Zhu Changwen, the latter I won't be talking about today, were in fact called gardens of pleasure. So our paper explores some basic questions surrounding this 11th and 12th century discourse of gardens. So the first is, what is pleasure? And what does this pleasure mean in the context of these very different cultures with very different conceptions of the garden, very different living gardens, very different ideas about pleasure? What might have been particular to the pleasure associated with gardens in the 11th and 12th centuries, a time when high degree education, including knowledge of the classics, was especially valued? How does the pleasure discourse unfold, and what does it tell us about the importance that the garden had for the literati who wrote about them? So I should state at the beginning that there was nothing new about people writing about gardens in the 11th century. Indeed, there are precedents for both writing about gardens and constructing gardens in China and Byzantium that went all the way back to antiquity. The Byzantines referring back to classical antiquity. And an important feature of these writings about gardens was a constant reference to previous writings about gardens. Nor was there anything new about people writing about the pleasure enjoyed in these gardens. Again, in both China and Byzantium, the association of gardens with pleasure had precedence extending all the way back to antiquity. So what was new in the 11th and 12th centuries was the sheer volume of writings about pleasure in the garden. Writings in which the garden was transformed into elaborate and coherent sites of ethical activity. And examining these writings provides us with a fascinating point of entry into how the garden functioned as a site and emblem of ethical self-development, self-conceptualization, and self-representation. The fact that it is gardens that function as a site for all of this makes clear how the very imagination of space, architecture, and topography can play a performative role, furnishing a conceptual frame for the agency and activity of the self. So, a note about terminology. Although I'm standing here talking about pleasure, none of the figures I will be talking about talk about pleasure, because of course pleasure is an English word. And one thing to emphasize in talking about pleasure in English is that it has the weight of certain associations from its very specific historical legacy. An association with bodily indulgence, hedonism, aestheticism, and so on. Someone who devotes one's life to pleasure is morally suspect, unless you're Oscar Wilde, in which everything's fine. This isn't what we're talking about. And so to approach pleasure in the context that we are talking about involves stripping away these kinds of associations to a certain extent and envisioning something a little bit broader, since the traditions I'll be discussing are certainly much more expansive in terms of the connotations and ontological assumptions behind pleasure. So for the Byzantine writings about gardens, we're dealing with a kind of complicated linguistic situation. The Byzantine discourse on gardens refers to pleasure through a variety of terms, usually terpsis, terpole, or hedone, but also haris. What is striking about these terms is that although the first set of terms means something straightforwardly like pleasure, they can be substituted by a word with a purely ethical connotation, like haris, meaning grace. And this double significance goes hand in hand, as we will see, with the fact that Byzantine gardens are often depicted as collections of beautiful and, if used correctly, ethical components that give pleasure. Byzantine writings about gardens are thus very much focused on giving elaborate descriptions of things in such a way as to convey how beautiful they are, and therefore productive of pleasure. And in fact, the very literary form of ekphrasis, which is one of the main genres of garden writing, is itself designed to produce pleasure and wonder in the listener. So in the Chinese tradition, there is an obvious candidate for the study of pleasure, and that is the term le, which is of key importance in the Chinese philosophical and literary tradition since its very beginning. Those of you who know classical Chinese know that that very character also is yue, meaning music. There's a very close association of music and pleasure. We won't talk about that today, unfortunately, fascinating as it is. So le is translated often as pleasure, but it's also often translated as happiness, delight, and joy. And it has very strong eudaimonistic associations, which makes it broader and much more unambiguously positive than the word pleasure. But it also encompasses sensual pleasure. So the pleasure of being in a garden, surrounded by trees and streams and so on. The term le can be found in early taxonomies of emotions, where it is part of usually the group of 4 basic emotions. So joy, anger, sorrow, and pleasure. Sometimes it includes fear and dislike and desire. So you have varying numbers of so-called basic emotions in the writings of early theorists. But le had a privileged status in that it went beyond being simply one of the basic human emotions. Especially in the early Confucian tradition, le was a criterion of the properly lived life. It appears in the very opening passage of the Analects of Confucius, the very urtext of the Confucian philosophical tradition. So, the opening passage, the master says, "To learn and repeatedly practice what one has learned. Is this not delightful? To have friends arrive from afar, is this not a pleasure? To be recognized by others but still feel no resentment, is this not what it is to be a superior person or a gentleman? So what is interesting here is that in this crucial opening passage to this crucial foundational text, the good life is described as one that involves being able to enjoy and take pleasure in certain kinds of situations. So being able to practice what you've learned, if you're a pianist, playing the piano, if you're a basketball player, playing basketball, doing your thing, right? Doing the thing that you're good at. I mean, what's better than that, right? What is more pleasurable than that? And the same goes for distant friends and having a reunion with them, right? So this is one of the truest pleasures in life. This is what Confucius is talking about when he's speaking about the sort of the proper forms of life. Right? You get to enjoy these kinds of pleasures. So in this passage, delight and pleasure aren't just emotions. They're part of a whole package involving one's dispositions, one's proper cultivation, and one's relationship to others. And in the background of it all, some kind of assumption about what we are as human beings, what we are like, and what it is good to be. And this whole package is what pleasure entails. And so in Confucius, and in the writings of many mainstream Chinese thinkers, from Confucius onwards, pleasure necessarily accompanies the realization of a good life and the attainment of virtue. If you live the right way and cultivate yourself properly, you will come to appreciate those things of true value, and you will get to experience ultimate forms of pleasure. All of this is going to be very pertinent to literary writings about the garden in the 11th century. So I would like to highlight a couple of themes from each tradition that I think are central to the discourse of pleasure. And the first, in the Byzantine case, the first is the idea that pleasure is bound up with its objects. And second, the garden as a site of self-cultivation. And within that framework, the virtue of moderation as an important feature of this discourse of pleasure. So Byzantine writings tend to represent gardens as collections of beautiful, pleasurable things, which corresponds to the classical conception of pleasure in terms of its objects. We can see this well as illustrated in the following passage of a 12th century novel by Euthymius Macrambolites, who gives an account of a young man who is sent as a herald to a nearby town and who enters the garden of a local aristocrat. The young hero and also narrator, Ismenias, together with his travel companion, admire the garden, and this is the account. In the following day, we went into the garden again and fed our eyes with its charms, drawing the pleasure, hedone, down into our souls. For the garden was the abode of all good things, a dwelling place for the gods, and was all charm or grace, grace and pleasure, kerasis, relief to the eyes, comfort to the heart, consolation to the soul, repose for the limbs, and rest for the body. So here, the pleasures of the garden derive directly from the fact that the garden is an abode of all good things and dwelling place for the gods. The pleasure thus marks the body and soul's reception of the beauty and goodness that is present in the garden. So the second theme, the garden as a site of self-cultivation, pleasure and the virtue of moderation. Theodore Prodromos, the most prominent 12th century Byzantine literatus, wrote a poem of 5 stanzas called On a Garden, which treats different aspects of pleasure created by the garden. Prodromos negotiates pleasure in the garden and combines both the secular Greco-Roman classical tradition with the Christian one, and in the end, the Christian one prevails. The first stanza of the series reads, "Look, O beholder, the pleasure of the garden. Come closer, touch the plants, no envy. Here a white lily, reap but with chastity. Here an abode, enjoy but with moderation. Here water, drink but do not become saturated. See also yourself like an imagus. You bloom, you decay like the lily. You spring, you dry up like the water. If you look, O mortal, at the garden, as I've said, you will indeed fill your heart with joy, and you will gain the salvation of your soul." In stanza 2, the author imagines the place of Eden, the Garden of Eden, which is used interchangeably with the very word garden. But he worries about the tree. Nonetheless, in stanza 3, he treats positively any form of interaction of the beholder with the garden, as he, the beholder, will enjoy a mystical aroma and will thus acquire knowledge of the Lord Creator of the creations. In the next stanza, Prodromos invites the reader to simply enjoy the garden, which pleases the viewers in many ways. Pleasure in this instance is freed from the negative connotations and becomes pure enjoyment. But in the following stanza, Prodromos interprets allegorically the beauty of the rose, which can wound or damage the beholder with its thorns. The author warns the beholder that there is nothing without effort in life. Prodromos discusses how the garden's pleasure is perceived and where this pleasure can lead to. So ultimately, Prodromos advises the viewer of the epigram to enjoy the garden, but with moderation, like life itself. And in this way, the garden becomes a place where the individual's potential can be realized. Now, turning over to the Chinese garden, two things I would like to highlight here. First is the idea of pleasure as a virtue, and second, the garden as a site of self-realization. And here the emphasis is on freedom, self-sufficiency, and agency. Now, the two texts I will focus on for my case study of 11th century China are two well-known writings by Sima Guang, called Record of the Garden of Solitary Pleasure, and Su Shunqin's Record of the Pavilion of Surging Waves or Blue Waves. There are some striking connections between these texts. Both texts are written by figures who have involuntarily left their official careers and have retreated into private life. For these men, the garden signifies more than a place to escape from the pressure of politics, to enjoy a more simple and modest existence. It is also an imagined arena in which to articulate and bring to fulfillment a vision of one's true and genuine self, and to make a bold claim about what is the real basis of values and moral worth. The pleasures of the garden are fundamental to this vision and its proper realization. So first, pleasure as a virtue. Sima Guang was one of the most prominent 11th century literary figures and the leading figure of what we might call a conservative faction in the court. He was chief chancellor for a time, and then once the political pendulum swung in the other direction, he decided to leave his official post and retreat to private life. In 1071, he settled into the ancient capital city of Luoyang and made a vow to, quote, unquote, keep his mouth shut and stay out of politics. 2 years later, he built a garden on the plot that he had purchased north of the city called the Garden of Solitary Pleasure. Sima devoted a prose essay to his garden titled Record of the Garden of Solitary Pleasure, as well as a bunch of poems. So he begins his essay by citing the classical reference that gave rise to the name of the garden. This reference is a passage from the 4th century BCE Confucian thinker Mencius. And the first chapter of Mencius discusses a series of audiences or meetings that Confucius had with King Hui of the state of Liang. The exchange is as follows. So Mencius had an audience with King Hui of Liang. The king was standing by the pond, gazing at the geese and deer, and said, "Do the worthy also take pleasure in these things?" And if you've read a bit more of Mencius, you will know that King Hui of Liang was obsessed with this problem because he was a man of many pleasures, like kings tend to be. But he also wanted to be a moral ruler. And so he kept checking with Mencius, is it okay that I like pop music? Is it okay that I like women? And Mencius said, it's okay. You know, he tried to sort of steer him in the right direction. So this is one of these questions. Do the worthy also take pleasure? Because I loved it. Mencius replies, only the worthy take pleasure in these things. Those who are not worthy, even if they have these things, do not take pleasure in them. So Mencius, to back up his statement, cites a passage from his classical heritage. In this case, it's a passage from the classic of Odes, the Shijing, the one about the virtuous King Wen, who took pleasure in his garden because he shared it with his people. So King Wen had a garden that was decked out with a tower and a pond, all these really fabulous things. And the common people helped him to build these things. And the king shared these delightful things with the people. Everybody was happy. And it was precisely because the king took pleasure in these things, together with the people, that they too were able to take pleasure in them. So for Mencius, pleasure is the testimony to King Wen's virtue. It's not just about taking pleasure in pleasurable objects. It's a capacity that only those people of virtue can experience. So for Mencius, true pleasure is by definition pleasure that is shared with people. Now when Sima Guang builds himself a garden and calls it the garden of solitary pleasure, he's making a very pointed allusion to that Mencius passage. But Sima says that Mencius' standards only apply to kings and rulers. They don't apply to people of modest means as himself. He's just a nobody, which of course he wasn't because he had been chief counselor. But the literati who write about gardens tend to emphasize that they're nobodies. They're just these humble people with simple needs and so on. So he gives two more appropriate examples. One is the pleasure of Yanhui in the Analects of Confucius. And the second is the blissful pleasure of animals, wild animals subsisting in nature. So in the Analects of Confucius, the master says of Yanhui, "What a worthy person was Yanhui. He lived in a narrow alley with just a bowl of rice to eat and just a gourd full of water to drink." He was really poor. Right? Others would not endure such a wretched situation, but it did not alter his state of happiness or his pleasure after his love in life. What a worthy person was Hui. Right? The second model focuses on the humble pleasures of the little animals that find their needs met in nature. So a bird in the forest, Sima observes, has nothing more than a branch for building its nest. And a rat has nothing to drink but water from the river. Each is content with his lot, Sima points out. And in this way, too, he, the old man, finds his pleasure. So in speaking about his own humble pleasures in the garden, Sima is claiming that like Confucius' disciple Yanhui, and like the little forest animals, he enjoys the pleasures of the circumstances without allowing his difficult predicament to tarnish his enjoyment. In this way, he claims for himself his own domain of pleasure, separate and independent from that of duties to his ruler. And the second theme, the garden as a site of self-realization, pleasure and freedom, self-sufficiency and agency. So in Sima's essay, he gives an account of 7 different sites that you can find in his garden. So he has a reading hall, there's a pavilion for playing with water, these are the actual names that he gives. Fishing hut, studio, translations up. Studio for planting bamboo, the plot for picking herbs, the pavilion for watering flowers, terrace for seeing mountains. It should make you wonder how, in fact, humble his garden actually was. But of course, he's a nobody, so how can this just a little patch of dirt? So Sima, he lists all these sites, and then he writes about how he would go to the reading hall to study the writings of the ancients, and then when he got tired of that, he would go fishing, or he would go gathering herbs, tend to his flowers, and then hike up to some lofty perch and take in the views. But the crucial passage is when he kind of reflects on that whole way of life. He explains why this is such a wonderful, pleasurable thing. He writes, "When I proceed, nothing pulls me along. When I stop, nothing brings me to a standstill. My ears and eyes, lungs and intestines are entirely my own, and I rely on myself alone. I don't know what pleasure in the world can possibly match this, and therefore I call my garden the garden of solitary pleasure." So Sima's declaration about his autonomy and freedom is to be traced back to his physical body and to his claiming of his body as his own. So even when politics has turned sour for him, he has lost his place in society and in the court, he's lost his career, his body is still his own, and he does with it as he wills. So this is what the garden makes possible. It offers a home for his body to roam freely and to enjoy the sheer pleasure of doing what he wants. So beyond simply the fact of a man enjoying his garden, Suma's testimony of the pleasure he has achieved in his garden is a kind of fierce defense of his own self-worth, his own freedom and agency, and ultimately in the validity of the life he has chosen for himself. Now, on to my second example, Su Shunshin's Pavilion of Surging Waves. And so he wrote a record, an account. That's sort of the genre that I'm focusing on for this paper. It's a very straightforward kind of account, which tends to be very autobiographical. And by the way, Charlotte asked before the talk if these gardens existed. So Su Shunshin's garden still stands. It looks very different than it probably would in the Song Dynasty. It's in Suzhou, and it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Famous garden city, so mostly Ming gardens, but some of them can be traced, at least genealogically, back to some period. So in his record of the Pavilion of Surging Waves, Su Shunshin highlights a very different way in which personhood is realized through the pleasure in the garden. So compared to Sima Guang, Su Shunshin is much more focused on the intrinsic features of the garden itself and on what they make possible, or it makes possible. He writes about how before he had purchased the plot for his garden, he had wandered about in Suzhou, where he was renting a house. He writes about his psychic and emotional frustration during his period of wandering, and how he failed to give vent to his feelings. Presumably, all those years as an official got him really worked up. He had a lot of rage and anger. He just was very frustrated. He wanted to let it all out, but he couldn't. And so he's hoping to find some place, some lofty and spacious abode that would allow him to relieve his feelings that he doesn't manage. So he finds it eventually when one day he ventures out of the city and follows a small path along the stream and comes upon a deserted plot of land covered with bamboo groves and far from the nearest house. So he buys this plot of land and builds a pavilion on the south bank of the stream and calls it Tama, or Surging Waves. Once he arrives at his property, Su manages to give expression to his suppressed feelings. He sings while drinking, he laughs out loud by himself, with only the birds and fish sharing his pleasure. That's his words, not mine. He then explains how this leads him to understand the Tao. Since my body attained what was proper to it, my spirit was no longer vexed. Since what I saw and heard was not depraved, the Tao was illuminated. So it's in the garden that Su comes to attain what he needs, what is proper to his person, both body and spirit, and thereby come to understand the Tao, which here I think we can take as the proper order of things, but also the proper way to live. The pleasure of the garden enables Su to realize his most fundamental aspirations and thus realize himself as a human being. So stepping back to consider the discourse of pleasure in 11th century, 12th century China and Byzantium, we can well appreciate how vastly different the two cultural and conceptual worlds were. So with respect to ownership, Byzantine literati most likely did not own gardens, and they wrote in a genre that was very much rhetorical, full of rhetorical devices, and a genre that was designed to evoke pleasure and wonder. Chinese literati often owned gardens, and so they could manipulate the space of the garden physically. They had total control over its contents, and they also wrote straightforwardly and autobiographically. As far as the locus of agency is concerned, Byzantine writings emphasize pleasurable objects that linked up directly to the passive recipient of the pleasure. And in the case of Chinese literati, they proclaimed through their pleasure in their garden their virtue and their authority over moral values. At the same time, though, I think there are some important commonalities as well, and these may point to some tentative answers to the question I posed with the title of my talk, what we can learn from comparing medieval traditions. First, both share the idea that pleasure is an essential part of the virtuous life. In both the Chinese and Byzantine discourses, pleasure is clearly more than just a psychological or affective state, but a crucial part of what it means to live a virtuous life. True virtue entails pleasure, and an important part of the interest in the garden as an ethical space seems to be to furnish an arena in which the individual can achieve something like virtuous pleasure, So the discourse of pleasure is part of a very ethically complex package that shows how important pleasure is to our physical and moral well-being. Second, the pleasurable garden as a site of self-cultivation. In both cases, ideas about values and human possibilities find expression in the architectural and spatial site of the garden, a site through which an ideal self can be cultivated, realized, and ultimately expressed. Chinese literati fashioned out of their gardens a topographical emblem of their ideal selves, while their Byzantine counterparts channeled their creativity into rhetoric and crafted beautiful rhetorical structures. But irrespective of whether they actually owned the gardens they wrote about, both created their own worlds in the space of their garden, and in this sense, exerted ownership over them. So both of these themes are a testimony to the power that literati had over words and their identification with moral authority. In a world in which their political fortunes were very much dictated by their place in an imperial order that was beyond their control, and where their political and material circumstances might have been quite precarious, to write about the pleasures that one enjoyed in one's garden may have been the ultimate declaration of one's own freedom, self-worth, and autonomy. For whatever life, fate, the powers that be threw at them, the pleasures they enjoyed in their gardens, whether imagined or real, were their own. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Yes, we have 25 minutes for questions, so I'm going to open the floor.
Can I start? Okay, so I had a couple of related questions, maybe both to do sort of with methodology. So kind of thinking about where your archives are, if it's all poetic or record kind of ekphrastic descriptions of gardens, or looking at illustrated texts of gardens, any remnants of the gardens now, which you answered a little bit. And so kind of trying to get a sense of where the archive is. And then also the point you mentioned about what was new in the 11th century is this kind of increase in volume of texts that are describing gardens. And I'm just wondering if you can comment on that vis-a-vis sort of just a sheer increase in volume of writing in general in the 11th century with these places, and maybe also with the kind of rise and fall of genres. Because I would think that if you are starting to see the emergence of new genres, those genres may attend more toward descriptions of pleasure, emotions, gardens, and things like that. So if you know, the epic is falling out of favor and the lyric mode is really coming into favor, you would expect a movement of that.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So, two big questions. I mean, we have to sort of restrict our view to certain types of genres. And we also are making a distinction between discourses of gardens and actual gardens, because that's a whole other thing. Reconstruction of gardens, we don't have the archaeological expertise, or we're not, I mean, it's relevant. Actually, there was a part in this paper where I did sort of summarize some basic features, the physical features of the garden, and those differences are really fascinating too, right? You have one difference is the Byzantine gardens from this period. They emphasize how the fact that they're enclosed, they're walled gardens, and they become walls during this period, which is interesting, right? Especially given that there's this whole ethical discourse going on, whereas Chinese gardens tend to be much more open and emphasizing views. So the physical thing is relevant, but we can't really make claims about that. We can only make claims about how people engage with some idea of their own gardens. And we've been focusing, I guess, on sort of the go-to sources at the beginning. I mean, I haven't looked at, much of the poetry. I haven't looked at many literati. We talked about gardens. I mean, this was sort of the first step in looking at these differences. So we had to kind of restrict our view. I suppose once we are able to look at a broader range of sources, we can see what are the particular characteristics of each genre and how they may correspond or maybe different aspects. The second question was about, right, just more people write, it's true, more people writing. And I think that's part of the package of what's happening now. You've got literati as people who define themselves as bearers of civilization, one of whose primary activity is to learn and to write. And so they're just writing a whole lot. But the pleasure discourse, I think it's partly about, writing more about one's emotions, writing more autobiographically, but that, the fact that there are these genres that are more amenable to that, that's the same history, right? So I think it's part of a larger thing. And my approach is not kind of focusing on a particular genre and making claims about just the genre, but sort of shifts in the sensibilities and shifts in what is becoming legitimate to speak about. So, and if you compare, I didn't get into sort of differences with earlier gardens, but earlier gardens don't write in this way about gardens. And they don't, so there are different issues involved when they tell about gardens, so I think that's also quite telling. You can write about a garden in 100 different ways. So,
I have a comparative question, which is what did you learn about Chinese gardens through studying about the Byzantine gardens? And what do you think your colleague was more on that and thinking about some Chinese gardens?
thank you. So, my colleague and I we have very different skill sets. And that's the other thing too, that our normal working mode is so different. She's much more philological than I am. I'm more philosophical, and I've got more intellectual history background, she has more literary background. So, so when we sit together and try to talk about things, it's hard, actually. It was a struggle, and we had to go through several rounds of, why is that a thing at all? So, I think she learned she came to appreciate some of the broader connections with the whole political situation, how literati are trying to write a space for themselves within the empire. And although they are working in different genres, that act is the same, I feel. And so that's one of the things that I learned. Everything that I conclude about Chinese literati in the 11th, 12th centuries, as far as I know, they're unique, right? And then you see that on the Byzantine side, although on the surface, so many things are different, but they find different ways to make similar maneuvers because they are in kind of the same predicament, right? They have culture on their side. They've got this imperial order that they're in constant struggle with because they need that. They need to be part of it, and yet they don't want to buy into it. So I see these these larger patterns, how it works in imperial cultures. So I think that is relevant for any kind of having a global view of what's going on in this period. Of course, these are both imperial cultures. Western Europe might be a whole other thing, but noting the commonalities was something that was striking. So I think because she's more philological too, I started to pay a little bit more attention to the genre question. And so we sort of fill out each other's methodological gaps or narrowness.
So my own understanding of Chinese gardens are very much formed by the writings of people like Greg Kunis, art historians who study primarily Yin garden, but also talk about Song gardens. So actually the gardens although, Ming literati use the same kind of rhetoric or similar kind of rhetoric as Song literati, but if you actually look at the physical existence and historical records, it seems that the gardens were primarily, first of all, pricey real estate properties, and secondly, sites of conspicuous consumption. You would, spend a huge amount to buy a piece of rock and dismantle the city wall to ship it to your gardens, and then it's the site where mostly illicit romances happen.
Yeah.
Right, so these are kind of like the opposite to the kind of virtuous pleasure that you're talking about. This is precisely the kind of bodily indulgence that is actually happening in the garden. So I'm trying to understand, so how do you reconcile what's actually happening in the gardens and what the ideal of garden was depicted by these people?
So the idea of the garden changes, right? So what happened in the Song, in the whole Song configuration, the garden performed a particular function for these literati. The fact that, 2 or 3 centuries later, it's become totally transformed, it's not a problem, right? People, it has a different space, different place within the whole, society, within the whole political order. So, that's what happened to the garden. And I don't think Klona says there is no such thing as a Chinese garden. Right? There is no, you can't essentialize it. So in the Song, it becomes the focus of a particular kind of representation. Right? And then in the Ming, it becomes very different. So, it shows the diversity, and actually, because of Klona and because of the strength of his work, everyone knows about the Ming garden. Very few people know that much about the Song garden. There's some art historians who've been writing about it, but I think the focus, there is an emphasis on private life, right? But I think it's really worth exploring. I was interested in pleasure because it seemed a bit like they were touting it too much. It was, these are guys who got kicked out of court, and they have many grievances, and yet they're talking about all their pleasures, their instruments and how much they love to read. So what's going on, right? It's not, there is a kind of a dark side behind all of their writings, and I think this is, they want to claim their pleasure as I've been trying to articulate in my paper. So the garden had a very different meaning for them. It was also, it wasn't an object of consumption, right? And in the Song period as well, there were probably very wealthy people who built very elaborate gardens. Someone Wong himself probably said that he doesn't want to talk about that part of his garden. He wants to say that it was a humble place. So, the garden changes over time.
One of the things we know about 11th century Byzantium is that gardens were not only a source of pleasure, but sites of considerable political importance. Especially in the 11th century, cultivated the demonstration of what today we would call their global command. You showed us the Julian mosaic early on, which has a cougar and other animals displayed. This was intended to be read as signs of the emperor's universal dominion. Similarly, in your portrait of Gregory Nazianzus, which you have there on the right, the display of various marbles again demonstrates the reach, the imperial reach. So I think that one dimension that is essentially to be connected with your main thesis, with your main juxtaposition of Byzantium and China. Now, I can't speak for China, but certainly in Byzantium, the political dimension cannot be ignored.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't highlight that too much in this presentation, but in the actual paper, we do get into the whole sort of the larger motivation behind Virag and Byzantium writing about gardens. But they had no, I mean, they were within the imperial arena. So these were not private spaces for them. And so they can write, all they could do is write beautiful text about it. They can't claim that space. So it's an act of resistance, but the political reality is that they're within that.
This is other Song dynasty menageries too, as there are in Byzantium. It's menagerie a type of display of imperial power.
So there were imperial gardens. And
Yeah,
there
but
were
I'm talking specifically about menageries.
menageries.
Zoos.
Menageries, yeah, there are not menageries in imperial gardens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's important.
Yes.
I think one of the things we may be trying to tease out in Charlotte's question and some of the questions that followed, and certainly your question, is the question of labor and its relation to ethics and aesthetics. Right? So who builds these gardens? And then there's this notion of a leader who shares his garden as that somehow being ethical. What's difficult to understand in the way that you, for me to understand, I shouldn't speak for everybody else, in the way that you posed the piece, is you sounded like you were persuaded that the pleasure that these people are taking is a break from imperialism, whereas I see it as completely continuous with imperialism. You just move your imperial power to the garden, right? So you don't have as much to manage, and you call it escape. I mean, it comes up in a lot of imperial places. It reminds me very much of when I was growing up, and white women would say, come see my fantastic garden, and you go over there and there'd be 3 black gardeners creating her garden, right? And so for me to try to understand this as, to believe that this is an escape from the garden seems to me to be somewhat naive. Like, yeah, that's what they're performing, but the pleasure is that you get to control a smaller environment and it's yours to control, and the emperor doesn't mess with it. But I don't know that that's, for the reader at any rate, an escape from imperialism.
I don't know, I mean, I don't think I was making any argument that it was an escape from it, the logic of imperialism or the forms of imperialism.
I just don't know how you write about gardens so beautifully and actually build the gardens at the same time. That's what I mean by the question of labor. Like, who's building these gardens?
I mean, they actually they speak about working in their gardens, right? So and which is a different case from people who had very extensive compounds and had very built gardens. But these guys...
So that guy who had all those different things, he built them all himself?
Yeah, so I was saying that Sima Guang, he gives this, he presents himself as a nobody, right? But he's built all these structures. He's got to have servants. He's got, he's a wealthy.
That's exactly it. I mean, he didn't build them himself. He has servants who built them.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's not contradictory to what I'm saying, because I'm not saying that they were actually nobodies who would, was just a patch of dirt. It was like, this was their presentation.
No, and I understand that, but I think the point about menagerie is to the point in the sense of I'm having a hard time. I know that you don't think that what they think is ethics is what you think is ethics, but I'm having a hard time understanding what you think is ethical about these gardens.
Oh, maybe, so the question,
Yeah, because you talk a lot about ethics.
Mm-hmm. They see themselves as displaying their virtue through their garden and actualizing their virtue.
Yeah.
So this is their performance of virtue.
Right.
I don't know if they are virtuous people. I don't have insight into their private lives. I see what they write, and they're declaring their virtue all the time.
Yeah.
And the basis of that is that they...
Methinks the gentleman doth protest too much, that's all.
Exactly. That's exactly it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's about performance and representation. And it's true. There are other accounts. There's a famous 11th century literati, Sushur, who gets kicked out, he gets exiled, end of the world, and he writes a bunch of poems his estate. And basically, the whole series of poems brings him from living in the wilderness to recreating civilization in his estate. You know, how hubristic is that, right? But that's the imperial way, and that's what they do in their own little, whatever domain they have. So, yeah, I don't,
Thank you.
yeah.
My question is pretty much related with everybody. And could you speak more about their specific philosophy behind this garden? For example, like 11th century Neo-Confucianism, first generation, who usually love lotus flower. They have plenty of essay about lotus flower, but there's nothing with religion, but with their philosophy. They like a lotus flower come out of muddy dirt, but come out muddy dirt, but it pretty much clean, pretty much purified, something like that. So this is Neo-Confucianism. Like 11th century, like a Zen Buddhist garden, which we are preserved here in Japan. They highly emphasize simplicity. They design everything as simple as possible. And pretty much, I think Penn State, there is a small garden techniques around the museum area. Is 11, the portal, the first is pretty much from this Zen Buddhist garden, this design. So like what you say, Su and these people, do they have a very specific philosophy?
Philosophy about the garden? They don't.
To reflect behind this garden.
So I think their focus is all on themselves through their garden. Really, they want it's themselves writ large. It's so they're not interested in garden design. They're not interested in theorizing about plants, only insofar as it's relevant to sort of the whole kind of the moral project. So it's really about themselves. It's an autobiographical project. So yeah, it's very different.
What I think is so interesting that was stressed here, and also in your response to John Abel's question, that you think that the really central focus of this comparison deals with different ways of envisioning self in the empire, and that they're both kind of, what I heard her saying was that they're not leaving the empire behind, they're very much a product. But if you could emphasize that, I think what a lot of people were feeling was that there was this sense that, oh, you know, everything's so beautiful and aren't I just a great, and to really contrast this with the reality of this, are there other kinds of gardens around for the public to actually share in, like Mencius had envisioned early on in the tradition? Are there, or is it their total private kind of like recreation of their glory, you know, outside of, you know, they have all the money, everything, all the resources from their careers and their great reputation as these literati, and therefore they're still a part of that dynamic. And so, are there other forms of gardens at the time where it's that kind of this contrast with what's out there sheds light on this imperial project even more? I think that would be just a kind of a touch that would just like really, you know, bring out those main.
So it's about whether there were gardens in which people were actually associated.
Well, to kind of contextualize their world of the garden within a larger world of how people interacted. You know, I don't know if we can even know this at the time, but you were saying that there were some gardens that
Well,
were
there were
Green
gardens
gardens.
back in the Han Dynasty, right? But those were primarily imperial gardens.
Yeah.
And only started in Song Dynasty when private household, very wealthy private household could afford gardens. But it's a matter of fact that anyone who has garden knows to keep a beautiful garden, it's tons of work. And none of these people were doing
Tons of
make the joy of it. They might just, you know, like go watering flowers for half an hour, but they're not doing 99% of the work, right? That's clear. And they will not share in the garden because the public there.
Okay, so the gardens as a product of the kind of imperial economic apparatus as well.
That's just factually that's the case, but I think the rhetoric, the philosophy of garden, rhetoric of gardens is like almost like the stark opposite of what's actually happening in the gardens. So I guess that's,
But it is true that the enclosure is not that important. So so some of these gardens actually, people walk through them. They're not like completely privatized spaces. So in the case of, and then I think so.
That would be really interesting to point out then, to kind of like the uses of these gardens and how much these people were invested in, sharing that with the public, more sharing it with other people.
Or were they so far away from the city that there was minimal traffic? Those are the kinds of things I'd be interested to know.
Yeah, like Su Shenqin's garden is kind of out there.
Yeah,
Right?
so
It's
you don't
away
need a
from-
barrier if people are.
But there were also gardens in the city. The Byzantine gardens were in the city,
Yeah.
right? That's why they needed the walls.
Well, that's what I mean, yeah.
Just back on what Erica talked about here, it's important to discuss the ethics and the aesthetics in gardens in the context of empire. And I would say that kind of critique, really study it as you have shown the formations. But then later in Han Dynasty, we look at the food written by Sima Xiangru and Yang Xiu. They talk about imperial gardens, and when they talk about pleasure, they were suggesting, hey, open up the gardens to ordinary people, let them to do farming or husbandry in your big imperial gardens. And then Yang Xiu was writing about how the emperors employed hundreds of people to try to catch wild animals to entertain foreigners. So it was explicit critique of the labor issue in those very early, 2 century BC writings in Han Dynasty. So there has been this kind of tradition in critiquing labor issues, the aesthetics in the context of empire. But I just wonder, whether in the end, are you going to trace that kind of discourse over the years to highlight certain issues that have been always there, and then new issues, for example, in your case, talking about these rich officials when they retire, they create this kind of escape of personal space through gardens.
Right. I guess that would take me off in a very particular trajectory, which is maybe for somebody else, because but I think this is one of the ways in which this whole power dynamic plays out, right? The self of the literatus and the imperial order. And and between the two, and something I haven't talked about, but the social identity of the literati, right? They're a bunch of literati who have the same, they share this culture of appreciating beautiful things. So I think it's an instance of that. I should probably leave it to someone who kind of specifically wants to study gardens for several years to undertake that project, but it's good to take that into consideration, right? Because that discourse, they were very highly aware of the precedents of what they were talking about.
I think we are at time, but if one last question.
All right, funny question.
Okay.
I remember 15th century English essayist Bacon, who wrote about essay about garden. He said, God first create garden. Indeed, it is the purest pleasure of man. All right, today so many American, I think American campuses suffer a lot of depression, anxiety. So what do you think about this medieval garden?
Creation anxiety.
Depression, anxiety.
Depression.
Depression, anxiety, 抑郁症. All right, so how about medieval age, this garden can help?
Well, this Su Shenqin, he was very depressed. His feelings had been repressed. He was so full of anger. He was so, disenchanted with what's going on in the life of an official. So that was a way for him to, place himself in a situation where he could engage with the world, but on different terms. So, I guess I would say that that's pretty good therapy. There is a lot of that going on in the world today, right? The tree therapy or whatever, tree bathing. So there is some wisdom to that, for sure.
Well, thank you very much.